Lewis Hamilton knew this race was changing before the final numbers made it obvious. In Shanghai, Ferrari gave the crowd a fight. Hamilton and Leclerc went wheel to wheel for the last podium spot, and Hamilton later called it one of his most enjoyable races in a long time. But while that battle was happening, Mercedes were running a very different race at the front. Antonelli won, Russell completed the 1-2, and the gap behind them told a bigger story than the podium alone. This breakdown follows the timing, the race flow, and the decisions that shaped the final result. Because the real question from China is not who battled hardest. It is whether Ferrari realized too late where the race was actually being lost. Before we go deeper, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. I read every single comment. And something a lot of people ask is how these news videos are made. The truth is, simple videos like this helped monetize multiple YouTube channels. If you want to learn how to create channels in this format, there's an ebook in the pinned comment. Just click the link and see how it works. At first, everything looked exactly how Ferrari wanted. Competitive pace, strong positioning, Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc pushing each other to the limit, lap after lap, trading positions, choosing different moments to deploy energy. It was intense, clean, controlled, the kind of internal battle that usually signals confidence inside a team. From the outside, it felt like Ferrari was fully in the race. But inside the paddock, a different feeling was starting to grow, because while that fight was unfolding, something else was happening, and almost no one reacted to it in time. Mercedes was not under pressure. That was the first signal. Antonelli wasn't forcing the pace. He wasn't defending aggressively. He wasn't being dragged into the chaos behind. He was controlling the race. Russell stayed consistent. No sudden spikes, no visible instability, just rhythm. And in Formula One, when a car runs in that kind of rhythm for long enough, it usually means something very specific. The car is not being pushed to its limit yet. And that is where the race begins to change. Because while Ferrari was investing energy into its internal fight, Mercedes was doing the opposite. They were saving, managing, waiting, not reacting to the race, but shaping it quietly. And that difference only becomes visible later, not in the first laps, not in the early stints, but when the race reaches its final phase. That is when everything started to shift. At first, the gap looked manageable, the kind of difference that could disappear with one well-timed strategy call, but it didn't. Instead, it grew, slowly, then steadily, then unmistakably. Lap after lap, the distance increased, not because Ferrari collapsed, not because of a clear mistake, but because Mercedes began to push at exactly the moment Ferrari could no longer respond. And inside the garages, that raised a different kind of question, not about speed, about timing. Because this wasn't a sudden advantage. It looked controlled, almost prepared. Tire behavior remained stable. Energy delivery stayed consistent across the final laps. The car didn't fade, it built momentum. And when a team can increase performance in the closing stages like that, it usually means the race was never run at full capacity from the beginning. It was managed toward a moment. And this is where Lewis Hamilton's experience becomes impossible to ignore. Few drivers read races like that. Years inside Mercedes built that instinct, understanding phases, recognizing patterns, knowing when the leader is not showing everything yet. And during that final stint, the signals were there. The gap opening without resistance, the inability to match the pace, the realization that this wasn't about one lap, but about an entire race being controlled from the start. But Ferrari was still fighting internally. Hamilton and Leclerc continued pushing, precise, professional, but locked into a battle that at that point was no longer deciding the race. And that is the detail that changes the entire interpretation of Shanghai. Because while most people were watching that duel, the real race was already slipping away at the front, and by the time it became obvious, it was already over. More than 20 seconds of gap at the finish. In a regulation era designed to keep cars closer together, that number stands out immediately, not as a random outcome, not as pure circumstance, but as a signal that one team understood exactly when to push, and another did not react in time. And that reframes everything, because Ferrari did not lack pace. The car showed consistency. Hamilton delivered one of his strongest performances since joining the team. The internal fight was clean, controlled, and competitive. The potential was there. But in Formula One, potential only matters when it is applied at the right moment. Mercedes chose that moment. Ferrari missed it. And sometimes that is all it takes. Because races like this are not lost in dramatic failures. They are lost in small delays, in decisions that seem correct in isolation, but disconnected from the bigger picture. While Ferrari focused on what was happening between its own cars, Mercedes focused on what the race would become later. And that difference created the gap, not instantly, but inevitably. So the real story of Shanghai may not be about who was faster. It may be about who understood the race first. And that is a much more uncomfortable question. Because if this was about timing, then it means the gap was not just on track. It was in awareness, in reading the race, in recognizing when the battle in front of you is no longer the one that matters. And that brings everything back to one final point. Did Ferrari lose this race because Mercedes had more performance, or because they were fighting a battle that had already stopped deciding the outcome? Because in Formula One, the difference between winning and losing is rarely just speed. Sometimes it is the moment you realize what is really happening, and sometimes that realization comes too late. If this kind of analysis is what keeps you watching until the end, subscribe to the channel and stay close. And now, the discussion moves to you. What really decided Shanghai? Pure pace or perfect timing?